Hello and welcome to GLAAD's Google Hangout. We are here to talk about what's next for LGBT Catholics and their allies at this particular moment in time. I have a couple special guests with us today. They're folks that have been doing LGBT Catholic advocacy for several years. Marianne Duddy-Burke is the executive director of Dignity USA. She lives in Boston with her wife Becky Duddy-Burke and their two adopted daughters Emily and Infinity. Francis DiBernardo is the executive director of New Ways Ministry, and he has been for the last 3 weeks providing reporting and analysis from the Vatican while the Synod on Marriage and Family has been happening as well. And soon we hope to be joined by Janet Quezada, my colleague here at GLAAD, who is a media strategist in the Spanish language media program. She's done a lot of work with me and with us. We helped to put together GLAAD's resource called The Papal Visit, a journalist guide to reporting on Pope Francis and the LGBT community. We wrote that both in English and in Spanish, and provided it for journalists to cover Pope Francis' visit to the United States, and then the follow-up that was happening in the Vatican with the Synod on Marriage and Family. And this is a conversation that we are going to have back and forth. I've got several questions that I want to ask the panelists. I want to get some conversation, but we also want to make sure that you that are watching can be a part of this conversation as well. And so if you could submit your questions on Twitter, just tweet your questions, use the hashtag LGBT Catholics, and we will do our best to address them on the air. So it's LGBT Catholics. This hangout, we wanted to do it now because it comes after a really busy and anxious month for LGBT and allied Catholics. In September, Pope Francis was visiting the United States. While he was here, he addressed Congress, he spoke to the United Nations, and participated in the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia. While he was here, a lot of LGBT people were calling on him to say some particular word of welcome for LGBT people. No specific word was really given. And then, pretty much right immediately after Francis' departure from the United States, LGBT Catholics around the world, including some representatives from Dignity and from New Ways, gathered in Rome for the global network of Rainbow Catholics. This gathering coincided with the beginning of the Synod on Marriage and Family, and that has been lasting for the last 3 weeks. Which pretty much brings us up to today. The last couple of days we've seen a report from the Synod. It was released with very little about LGBT people. A lot of people have said it just reinforced the status quo. And before I continue, I want to also invite and thank my colleague here, Janet Quezada, for joining us. She is seated by me. Scoot over a little bit, and we can do this together. And I guess what I wanted to do first was, Marianne, can you summarize what you saw LGBT was included in the report? And are there messages that exist there for LGBT people and their loved ones?
Yeah, I actually think there is very, very little that's positive for LGBT people in the Synod's report. I read it primarily as a victory for the folks who were disturbed by the positive comments about LGBT people and same-sex relationships that were in the interim report in the Extraordinary Synod last year. And those folks really got to kind of hold the line here. I think folks wanting to unpack this, the main paragraph dealing with LGBT issues is paragraph 76 of the 94, I believe it is, that comprise this report. And there are a few main points in that paragraph. The most explicit language is at the beginning. It talks about families with homosexual members need to respect the dignity and welcome those people with respect in the families, and to avoid any unjust discrimination, which is a phrase that has shown up in a lot of sort of official Catholic doctrine about gay people. Notice there's no mention there of transgender or genderqueer folks in that language. The paragraph goes on to say that there should be specific attention to accompaniment of families with gay members. So perhaps that could be interpreted as encouragement for ministries to LGBT families and Catholic families. It also says that same-sex unions cannot be regarded as even remotely analogous to marriage and to God's plan for marriage and family, so a repeat of traditional doctrine. And then it goes into this red herring of an issue around financial aid to developing countries should not be contingent on laws supporting marriage equality. So all of that is packed into the single paragraph that is the focus of issues on LGBT issues. There are three other paragraphs I want to mention quickly for folks who want to unpack this. Paragraph 8 talks about the ideology of gender and, you know, a way in which gender is looked at as not male, female, and doesn't respect reciprocity. Paragraph 33 sort of decries the use of reproductive technology to help form families, and specifically decries its use by non-heterosexual or regularly married families, so clearly pointing at gay folks who use reproductive technology to form their families. And then in paragraph 65, there's a sentence around children having the right to grow up in families with a father and a mother. Again, reinforcing that notion that same-sex couples or LGBT individuals are somehow unfit to parent. I think the place that some people have found hope in this document about LGBT people is that towards the end it also talks about this Catholic concept of the internal forum, you know, place where decisions are made in good conscience, you know, in the relationship that one has with God. And it's specifically talked about in the context of divorced and remarried people, you know, that each individual situation has to be taken in its own particularities. And some folks have seen that internal forum language as potentially hopeful in that it could be extended beyond the divorced and remarried, certainly, to the situation of LGBT people.
That's really helpful. Thanks for that's a good background. And Frank, you're in Rome right now. You've been doing at least once daily reports during the entirety of the synod. And I noticed in your reporting you talked, you kind of noticed there have been some really big divisions among bishops in regard to LGBT people. You get some fairly hopeful comments. You get a lot of resistance to even continuing the conversation. Some didn't want to talk about LGBT people at all. Some wanted to reaffirm the status quo. Some wanted to talk about further inclusion. How do you think that played out? And then can you also sort of just take us through how a synod works for people that don't, that kind of aren't familiar with this process?
Sure. Ross, I think I'll answer the second question first. A synod is a consultative body of bishops, bishops from around the world. There were 270 of them at this meeting, and there are about 5,000 bishops in the world, so it's just a very small part of the number of bishops. And they come together to discuss a topic. In this case, it was marriage and family. The bishops, a good number of them are elected by their national or regional bishops' conferences to represent their area. And then a number are appointed by the Pope. And then there are the members who are Vatican officials who participate in the synod. But the important thing, that's the composition, the important thing is that it's a consultative body. It's to get opinions from bishops all around the world to advise or make recommendations to the Pope. In one sense, the synod hasn't really ended yet because the meetings have ended, but we still have to await to see if Pope Francis will make a further statement adopting the recommendations that were in the report or not adopting them. or changing them based on the conversations that he heard at the synod. So, at the opening of the synod, Pope Francis directed the bishops, telling them a synod is not a parliament, and I think that was a good reminder to them that this is not a place where they had to either come to consensus or defeat one position and accept another position. That things like that, of course, did happen, but again, they didn't vote and make their final recommendations definitive, because the Pope has the power to veto all of it if he wants. So I think we have to remember that the report was the recommendations of the bishops gathered. Only thing the Pope is going to consider when and if he makes a final statement. Now, in terms of the divisions, yes, there were many divisions, and it was incredible. I think the most hopeful thing, from my point of view, about this meeting is that it exposed the fact that there are a number of bishops in the Catholic Church who want something better for LGBT Catholics than the status quo. Maybe there aren't enough of them yet to have been able to have the power to make those recommendations, but they're there, and it was a pattern that I saw, is that a number of them were people who've been appointed by Francis either to their dioceses or appointed as cardinals by Francis, or appointed to the synod by Francis. So I think that's I think that's a revelation about the type of bishop and the type of policies and pastoral outreach that Francis wants. So, yeah, there were divisions. One of the biggest, I think the two biggest blocks of voting blocks that people spoke about during the 3 weeks were the German bishops and the African bishops. And the German bishops being the more ones, and the African bishops being the more conservative ones, especially on LGBT issues.
And I can assume that.
So that's in a nutshell.
I can assume that some of those divisions. I assume that in the past, and probably even the recent past, that there were fewer divisions, and that there is some sense of movement. Although I think it's still incredibly slow, and I think that's that the point of having a conversation. What some people can see as a step, although it doesn't have any. The hard part is it doesn't have any actual impact on folks who are living their everyday lives here in the United States or around the world, and that there's still been stories of discrimination that's come out of the church that people have experienced. People have lost their jobs, things like that. I want to turn slightly. One of the things that the three of our organizations did, GLAAD and Dignity and New Ways, and 26 other Catholic and LGBT and Latino organizations in June sent a letter to the Vatican asking Pope Francis to sit down and listen to LGBT Catholics and their families during his visit to the United States. And then later, over 8,000 people joined that call on a Change.org petition started by a gentleman named Nicholas Coppola and GLAAD. One of the things that we noticed in the letter is that LGBT people in general and LGBT Catholics in particular are facing a pastoral crisis. LGBT Catholics feel like their spiritual home is no longer for them. We shared the statistic that 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. And even while this synod's taken place, we've seen various stories, things like John Murphy, who is fighting for his job at a Catholic-run nursing home in Virginia, and even an employee of the Vatican for coming out and sharing a little bit about his partner. And I want to turn to Janet, who's here with me, my colleague here at GLAAD, and your work specifically a lot with Spanish language media, with Latino communities. When we shared some of those resources, you were getting contacted right away for people to do comments. And how does how you understand the report and some of the things that Marianne shared sit with you? Latinos are way more accepting of LGBT people than they usually get credit for. And are you seeing the same kind of pastoral crisis that we were talking about? Does that play out in the Latino community in a particular way?
I think that that definitely resonates, because I'm thinking specifically of sisters. There's I think their names are Monica Alcazar and Ruby Alcazar. Monica is a lesbian woman, and Ruby is not, and they struggle a lot with being able to go to church together. I think that's one of the things that strikes me most about Latino. I think it might be true across the board, but Latino families go to church together. It's the grandmother all the way to the grandson that goes to the church together. And it's really painful when one part of the family can't go because they feel like they're going to be, something's going to be said at the pulpit, or somebody's going to judge them in the congregation in the pews with them, and that's going to be hurtful to them. And I think there's this thing where you don't want to go to church and say, oh, you can't come with me to church. I think that's what I see. So this idea that there's going to be what Marianne was talking about, the accompaniment, like the idea that there's more ministry. I think that's hopeful, because I think people want to talk about it. It's very confusing to see that your church, a place where you go for strength, for succor, is going to say that only you can come, but not your sister, or not your mother, or not your son, or not your grandson. And I also, Latino Catholics, I think, or Latinos in general, are more accepting. Like, I think the numbers are usually like 6 and 10 and 8 and 10, and they're high numbers. And I think as the generations go on, the younger Latino folks are the ones who are even more accepting. And I don't think the church wants to turn away the younger members, because that's the future of the church. So I think that's where they should think about it. I think that's the things that struck me from the report.
Frank, I want to go back to you and note that one of the criticisms of the Synod is, this is always one of the hard parts, is that these decisions are being made by bishops and cardinals, unmarried men who are making decisions on marriage and family, which are lives that they have never actually experienced. And is that one of those things? One of the things we talk about at GLAAD often, when we note the polling numbers of acceptance numbers for Roman Catholics in the United States, especially, is that they are very accepting of LGBT people, and it usually is members of the hierarchy that feel more out of touch or out of step with them. And I want to see if that's something that you that you also think that you feel and experience. And sorry, Frank, hold on one second. I have you muted for some reason, and I can't unmute you. When I try to get you fixed, I'm gonna direct that question to Marianne while I try to figure out what I did with you and muted you there. Can you talk about that a little bit, Marianne?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple things going on here. You know, the credibility of the Synod in general, because it has such a limited constitution, because it's people who don't have experience in raising their own family. Certainly these folks come from families, and they've done, most of them have done pastoral ministry with families and all of that, but they don't bring their own personal experience to that. The exclusion of women from any meaningful voting roles or input. There were women in the Synod who could voice their opinions, bring their perspectives, bring their knowledge to that, but they weren't allowed to vote, even if male colleagues who held similar positions were able to vote. So, that loss of the voice of women has long been criticized in the Synod. And I think that we have to remember that most of the bishops in the world were appointed over the last 30 years by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, for whom doctrinal orthodoxy was a real value, and upholding, teaching of the church or the tradition of the church. Whereas now, as Frank noted, we do see a turn more to the bishops and cardinals that are being appointed by Francis tend to have a more pastoral bent to them, and may be more in line with the positions of the majority of Catholics. But among the leadership in the church right now, we still have this 3 decades of legacy a very conservative leadership that we're bucking up against that is out of sync with Catholics in many parts of the world.
I think it's interesting too that what we're seeing is a very slow. The new bishops and the new cardinals that are coming in. That's probably where some of the change is happening, but we still have a very long legacy. But it is folks that are experiencing a lot of lives they don't have, and making judgments on lives that they haven't experienced. And I think that's a huge part of it. Frank,
and I would just add, as last year, there was nobody there participating in the synod who identified as gay or lesbian, bisexual, transgendered. There was no family member who was there speaking as an affirming, mom, dad, grandparent of LGBT people. So ours was a voice that was absent from the synod deliberations.
I want to ask, and maybe Frank, and you're not muted anymore, which is great. Thank you for taking care of it. One of the things that Marianne just noted too is that there's not LGBT people that were present or presenting or sharing, and it was an issue that came up during the World Meeting of Families about the lack of LGBT representation. There's one openly gay man who presented a workshop, which was on Courage, which is a group that is not exactly ex-gay, but very, very close to ex-gay. And I know kind of was put in sort of in that position. And then in the synod, that there was nothing. There was also the World Meeting of Rainbow Catholics too. What was the LGBT representation even around the Vatican or around Rome during the time of the synod?
Well, there was that LGBT global network of Rainbow Catholics. That was one thing. I did have the opportunity to ask two bishops, and Archbishop Supich at a press conference. I was able to ask him, if he's from Chicago, if he thought it would have been better to have the voices of LGBT people at the synod, and he gave a very flat yes, a determined yes, that he really would have wanted it. And he said that he felt that what he did in preparation for the synod, what a lot of bishops did, was have listening sessions, and they had the Vatican questionnaire, and he said he made sure that he had LGBT divorced people giving their remarried people giving their opinions. I asked that also of Cardinal Oswald Gracious of Mumbai, India, and he also said the same thing, that he thought the synod would have benefited greatly if LGBT people were allowed to present their points.
That's
view at the synod.
That's helpful. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we're a little bit. The connections got a little bit slow there. One of the things I wanted to also note, and maybe I'll ask Marianne this too, and this is some of the follow-up to the visit to the United States. I feel like when Francis was in the United States, he kind of kept himself very tight and very controlled. And then once he left, the news that came out afterwards seemed to kind of reshape in people's minds his visit. Technically, he did meet with an openly gay man, which was one of the things that we had asked in the letter and in the petition. It was a former student of his, someone he knew personally, and that student's partner. And then, of course, that news came out only after reports circulated about this controversial anti-gay county clerk from Kentucky who's refused to process marriage licenses for same-sex couples. And that seemed to get more of the news and more of the criticism in there. Marianne, I feel like the news that followed Francis' visit in the United States seemed to hurt the balance that he was keeping. Is this one of those examples in terms of how actions speak louder than words?
Well, I saw that the news follow-up as a real victory for LGBT Catholics and allies and anybody who's working for greater justice here. Because I think what happened, particularly with the Kim Davis county clerk situation, was that the right wing was really trying to position Francis as endorsing their efforts to roll back marriage equality and other kinds of religious liberty kinds of issues for LGBT folks. And I think after the outcry that occurred, you know, when folks really pointed out that if this meeting was allowed to stand as it was positioned by the right wing, that it really moved Pope Francis's visit from a pastoral visit to the United States to this endorsement of a very narrow and exclusionary political agenda. And the Vatican was forced to respond to that. You know, their initial statement was very wishy-washy, but after a day, they came back and made a very clear statement saying, no, this was an encounter that happened with lots of people, and it is not to be seen as an endorsement of Kim Davis's position or efforts to keep people from exercising their civil rights. And then it was followed up with this news that actually the one-on-one meeting the Pope had was with this former student that he's very close to, who is a partnered gay man. So I think it was that sense of the Vatican saying, yes, we do want a church that is open and welcoming, and, you know, a very important rebuke to those who would try and put the Pope and church leadership exclusively on the side of rolling back rights and pushing for these religious liberty things. So I think that was actually a very hopeful moment for us.
Thank you. And I want to just remind folks that they can tweet in questions with the hashtag LGBT Catholics. We've got a few more minutes together that we can field a few questions. A couple things that also have come up that I think are worthwhile in commenting on. Some of the questions that have come up, or terms that sort of been identified more recently with Pope Francis, and even a little bit in terms of the messaging that has gone through the World Meeting of Families and the Synod on Marriage and Family, have been terms like ideological colonization. That's shown up a few times in Francis's speaking in various contexts. And then what that also looks like, and this may be the best follow-up to what you just said, Marianne, the issues of religious liberty and where the hierarchy is going to place itself on issues of religious liberty as we're facing them here in this country. And maybe, Marianne, do you want to talk about those first, and then maybe I'll turn to Janet. You've been doing some work on some of the religious liberty issues and things like the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. But we'll start with Marianne.
Yeah. Again, I think this whole issue of using terms like religious liberty being trampled on and ideological colonization is a place where Catholic officials have teamed up in a very uncomfortable and unhelpful way with many of the sort of right-wing evangelical folks. And I think that we really need to put a stop to this ideological colonization thing, and particularly the myth that it's coming out of places like Africa and parts of Asia. And, you know, I just look to places like, you know, the South African Constitution, you know, as the first country in the world to write protections for LGBT people into their constitution, you know, non-discrimination written into their constitution. I think it was the 5th country in the world and the first in Africa to support marriage equality. I mean, you know, is South Africa any less African than any other country in Africa? I mean, this is a motion that came out of that country's experience of discrimination and alienation, and it was out of their people. And I think it's incredibly unhelpful for our church to be seen as supporting this kind of rhetoric that is really based in fallacy.
Thanks. And then, yeah, Janet, do you want to talk a little bit, especially with you may have thoughts on the ideological colonization idea, but also I want to hear about liberalist liberty and how that ties into some of the work that you've been doing right now.
I'll just briefly say what you just said, Marianne. Also, I was thinking about when the Pope was going to Paraguay, some of the groups that were invited to be part of the meeting were indigenous groups who decided not to go because they felt that he wasn't going to talk to them and place them at the level of an autonomous government, which that's what they are. They're indigenous people. They're representing their land, and they're talking about the ways that Paraguay, the government itself, is not respecting their boundaries and is not respecting their decisions. And so why that comes up is just I'm sorry if I get a little lost, but when you were talking, it's like you can't just talk about the way the church is talking about LGBT people. You also realize that indigenous people, which could include LGBT people amongst their ranks, also have grievances with the way that the church is treating them. And in all these countries, there are minority groups along with LGBT groups, but minority because they're indigenous or because they have battles with the government that are not being listened to by the church as well. So I feel like there's something there about making sure that all of us together are coming to the Pope and coming to the hierarchy and talking about it. But then about HERO in Houston, the human rights ordinance is being misrepresented, and it's being talked about as only about bathrooms and the idea that a man can go into a woman's bathroom. It's very confusing for people. They're going to sometimes. I talked to somebody in Houston, a taxi driver, who said in his church he was told you have to vote against this this proposition because exactly that they just basically parroted the opposition's line, and that's very hurtful for a person to go into a church where they're looking for pastoral care, where they're looking for strength and guidance, and they're being told confusing information that is not true about something that is political. So I think that it's important to look at the congregation and see people stand up and say, I'm here, I'm in this congregation, I myself am bisexual or transgender, or I have a family member who is LGBT, and I'm sitting here and I'm listening to this, and I know it's wrong and it's hurting me. I think there needs to be more talks from the pews. The congregations need to stand up and show the priests who are in front of their congregations who's there. I think there's a thing where it's the priest is up there and is officiating, but has to remember that they're there for the people who are there in the pew. People will go away if they're not being tended to and taken care of. People need to stand up and realize their power and show the priests who they are.
Well, and then with the last, we'll start to wrap up kind of slowly here, but a couple things I wanted to think about in terms of where we go from here. One of the big questions really has been, what are the next steps for us and our organizations? What are the next steps for the LGBT movement? What are the next steps for LGBT Catholics? And I think one of the places that we can kind of start that conversation, and I want to turn to Frank for this, and you started with this a little bit too, is to maybe assess what is going to be the real impact of this report. I know the media in the United States was they were so caught up in Francis' visit to the United States, and I feel like a little bit of the attention on the Synod has fallen off and the report, whereas this is the thing that could have potentially altered or shaped or set a future for church teaching. What, now that it's in the place it is right now, which is not wholly adopted, it's kind of out there and seeing whether it can get accepted or vetoed or modified or whatever, what can be the real impact, or what is the real impact of this report?
Me from the Synod as the most hopeful, and that is, and that have a direct impact on LGBT issues. And the first is that a theme that emerged is to alter some of the church's language regarding sexuality and marriage and family, including, the very harmful, dangerous, and inaccurate terms for lesbian and gay people, objectively disordered and intrinsically evil. I think that that's a fruitful area that we should be mining, knowing that that there are bishops that want to see changes with that language. The second was the emphasis on decentralization of church authority for pastoral ministry, so that the universal Catholic Church is not dominator. And by that I mean we do have a number of dioceses where gay and lesbian issues are still where they were in the United States 50 or 60 years ago. I think decentralization would allow bishops in countries where gay and lesbian issues are much more are understood much differently, can provide better pastoral care for these groups. And third is the emphasis on a listening church that came through in Pope Francis's statements constantly, and that we have to be a church that listens, even to the point of his closing homily at the Synod Mass. He stressed the fact that the church has to listen. And I think that if bishops want to take Pope Francis's direction seriously, that they need to follow that example of really being a listening church by having more formal listening sessions with LGBT people and their families.
Good, thank you. And maybe I'll turn to Marianne too and sort of ask you what impact does this have, and for you, where do you think that you continue to go from here?
Well, I mean, I agree that this report from the Synod report, the impact of this report really depends on the Pope's next step. I mean, it could become immediately irrelevant if he acts very quickly, or it could linger out in the Catholic world and be open to the various interpretations that it has. I think, and given that, I think that our continuing to press the Pope to have some formal meetings with LGBT Catholics and our families and listen to us, listen to our experience, listen to our challenges within the church and our hopes for the church and what we believe we can bring to the church continues to be important. I think there's a lot of work left, clearly, to achieve full equality in our church and in society. I think one of the clear priorities that we all have to have is to work to end the anti-LGBT violence and criminalization and discrimination that continues, here in the U.S. and all across the globe. I mean, this religious rhetoric and the beliefs that are parroted by some folks based in the kinds of language that did not get repealed in this document continues to cost people their lives, their homes, their families, their jobs, their educational opportunities, all of that. And that's an important thing for us to work on. I think there's a growing awareness of the situation of LGBT people across the globe, and that it varies so tremendously. And I think, anything that continues to raise our consciousness and help us see ourselves as one global community, all people of God, and working together is really important. So groups like the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, I think, have an important future for us and for our church. We're going to continue to work for full sacramental equality in our church, for absolute, unconditional acceptance in our church and membership, the ability to do the kinds of ministries that we're called to, and that being trans, being gay, being bisexual is not at all a disqualification for full participation in our church. And I think the final thing that we all have to work on is what Janet was talking about, that the church is not just the bishops. It's not just the leaderships. In fact, there are a very small minority in the church, that all of us are the church. All of us have that power to shape where the church goes, and therefore has the power to shape the impact that the Catholic Church has in the broader world.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I would say for us, and for GLAAD, I think some of the things that you talked about make a lot of sense. Where we are is going to be to continue to share those stories of LGBT Catholics that are still continuing to work for justice in their world, the people that have lost employment or been facing harassment or issues, and make sure that they have a voice with which to tell their story. I have a hunch that most people still don't really believe that someone can be fired for being transgender or for gay or bisexual, and making sure that people are aware of that reality. And as it pertains to Roman Catholic institutions, as it is with, say, John Murphy right now in Virginia, or wherever it comes up in the next place. And I think working for real protections, and also making sure that the protections are legal, but they're also things that are culturally acceptable too, and that it would be the sort of thing of, well, why would I really want to fire someone just for who they are? And I feel like the campaign work that's going to be happening in Houston and in other cities and states around the country are going to provide a real opportunity for us as GLAAD and for LGBT and allied Catholics to be able to speak out and state what their values are, and to give people a platform with which to do that. And I think as we do that, that's going to help move some of our help move some of this conversation forward, at least in the United States. And I think, and that can trickle out, and it's going to have to work in different ways in different places around the globe. But I feel like the work that we've been doing, both that you've all been doing within the church and some with outside of the church, has been particularly helpful in that as well. And so I want to just wrap up and see if there's any closing comments that people wanted to make. Janet, do you have any closing thing you want to say?
I just want to say I think that it's very hopeful that people who are LGBT and Catholic and allied and have families who are LGBT are meeting and talking more about their experiences together. And I think what Marianne was saying, I think it's just very hopeful to see that people are realizing their power and talking with each other and talking to about their experiences in the media and letting people know that they exist. Because I think that's the biggest thing, is convincing people that we exist, or that people of faith who are LGBT and allied exist.
Yep, I agree with you. Frank, do you have anything that you want to say closing-wise?
In closing, I'd just like to say that I think that while the Synod report didn't really say much or much good, I think that doesn't change the fact that a lot has changed with this Synod. I think we're going to see a lot more opportunities for discussion of LGBT issues, and we now know that there is a wing in the hierarchy of the Church who are willing to speak forcefully for our issues.
Thank you. And Marianne, I want to give you the last word.
I think that we're seeing a really important narrative here about the place of LGBT people in families, and the recognition, in the same way there used to be the narrative of God versus gay, it used to be gay versus family, and I think that a lot of this focus has made us all think about the important role that family has for the LGBT movement, both in terms of having our family members speak out of their own knowledge of us, love for us, care for us, becoming important justice allies, but also for us as LGBT people to claim the importance of family to us. I just think about how many families rely on their LGBT members to care for aging parents, to take care of ill or disabled siblings, to raise kids that can't be cared for by the natural parents, and the uncles or aunts become the parents for those folks. I think that it's time to really bring that conversation about family and faith much more into the center of our justice movement.
I think that's really helpful, and I just want to close out by saying, for folks that are watching this either live, or this is going to be put up on YouTube very shortly, and I'll put a blog post on GLAAD.org that will recap a little bit of this conversation and allow you to watch it. For folks that want to get connected and get involved, I would really encourage you to check out New Ways Ministry, check out Dignity USA. Both are valuable resources in the LGBT Catholic movement that have a lot of work and a lot of things going on. Marianne, I think you have a new website too. I just was looking at it this morning, and it looked redesigned from last time I was there. It looks cool.
It's been up for a few months, but yeah, we're trying to make it more interactive, and we also really appreciate all of GLAAD's support for our work and getting this messaging out. So it's a great partnership.
Thank you. And if folks want to sort of have a hub for resources, GLAAD.org/Pope is where the video for this lives right now. You can also look below and see the resource that we made for journalists, as well as some of the petitions and the hashtags and the tumblers that were being put together during Pope Francis' visit to the United States. So check out GLAAD.org/Pope, and I want to thank Francis P. Bernardo, Marianne Duddy-Burke, and Janet Quezada for joining me for the Google Hangout. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.
Thank you all.
Great. Thanks, Russ.
Safe travels, Frank.